The depths of bodies of water hide countless secrets and chilling evidence of tragedies and crimes. This discovery shocked the residents of the small town of Warwick in southern Oklahoma, USA, when one gloomy day, the waves washed the mutilated body of a young girl ashore. The horrifying find shook all 2,000 inhabitants of the quiet settlement, where everyone knows each other. The local police understood that the river bottom concealed evidence of numerous unsolved atrocities, but the great depth and fast current made them almost inaccessible. In the cozy town of Warwick, life flows measured and unhurried. In the fall of 1996, one of the houses was occupied by a wealthy family, Gail and Dwayne with their 4 children. Their 16-year-old daughter Heather, at that time a sophomore in high school and a cheerleader, was going through a rebellious period. An excellent student and a beauty, she wanted to try everything possible in life. Heather's adventurous nature sometimes took her too far. On the evening of October 2nd, 1996, an argument broke out between Heather and her mother over a $300 phone bill racked up by her daughter's chats with friends. The family was short on money. The father, an electrician named Dwayne, had nearly died and was seriously injured in a transformer explosion. Treatment and skin grafts required significant expenses, so while the men could not work, the mother took on an extra job. The woman tried in vain to instill in Heather respect for work and money, to foster independence. The daughter, however, was too stubborn to admit her guilt, which led to a fierce quarrel. When emotions subsided, the offended Heather silently went to her room, ignoring her mother and only wishing her father good night. The next morning, October 3rd, when Gail woke the children for breakfast, her daughter did not appear. The woman decided that hunger would force the stubborn girl to come downstairs, but she never came out. The mother went upstairs and was surprised to find the room empty. The alarmed parents called all of Heather's girlfriends, but none of them knew where she was. Heather had never run away before and had no mental problems. She was too tidy to go somewhere for a long time without clothes or cosmetics. Gail and Dwayne immediately reported the disappearance to the sheriff in Warwick. The woman told about yesterday's quarrel with her daughter over her endless phone chats. The sheriff tried to calm the worried parents, saying that teenagers often run away from home after conflicts, but usually quickly return. However, Gail and Dwayne knew their Heather was not like that. The girl always sought compromises, not hide from problems. This time, unfortunately, the mother's overly emotional reaction and the daughter's lack of restraint led to a sad situation. The police explained that a missing person report could only be filed 24 hours after the last contact, and sent the couple home to wait. But time passed, and there was still no news from Heather. Disappointed by the attitude of law enforcement, the parents decided to start their own search. First of all, they talked to their daughter's closest circle, her friends, including 17-year-old Randy Wood, the captain of the school football team. Although Randy and Heather's short-lived romance had ended, the young people remained friends. Randy Wood, Heather's first boyfriend, with whom she had recently racked up an astronomical phone bill shortly before her disappearance, assured the girl's mother of his complete ignorance of her whereabouts or possible vicissitudes. Despite his seemingly sincere intonation, Gail intuitively felt that the young man was hiding something. His speech sounded rehearsed, and his indifference to the fate of his former beloved betrayed a suspicious detachment. However, they could not catch Randy in a lie, so Gail decided to contact Josh Bagwell, Heather's new 17-year-old high school boyfriend. When the woman called Bagwell, his grandmother picked up the phone. The elderly lady reported that the young man was sleeping off a party, so she did not dare to wake him up. She categorically refused to call her grandson to the phone, incidentally admitting that she was just cleaning up the yard near the trailer where the schoolchildren had held a party the day before. When asked about Heather, the old woman replied that she had not seen the girl there. Having not received any useful facts, The parents of the missing girl drove around the entire district in a desperate search for at least some clue. But all efforts were in vain. So Gail and Dwayne, after waiting a day, turned to the police again. Only this time did the law enforcement officers join the search operation. After 7 days of Heather's absence, hope of finding her alive was fading with each passing hour. Later, a police patrol, inspecting the Texas border areas, noticed a body in the river, turned face down, half submerged in the murky waters. Passers-by on the bridge drew attention to the terrible find, although a thick layer of mud tried to hide it from human eyes. The divers managed to pull the eerie cargo ashore, but something much more horrifying was hiding under the dirt. The victim, whose mutilated body was covered with shotgun pellet marks, had obviously suffered from a point-blank shot from a shotgun. The face was so disfigured that identifying the deceased at first glance seemed impossible. A thorough forensic examination was needed. The investigation established that the unfortunate girl had been shot 9 times at close range. 1 in the back of the head and 8 in the back, which literally tore her body to pieces. Since at that time, only one person was being sought in this area. Heather Rich, the girl's parents, were called in for identification. The mother was able to recognize her daughter only by the engraved ring that she herself had given her, which dispelled any doubts. The deceased lying on the table in the morgue was indeed Heather. Dental records finally confirmed the victim's identity, as forensic experts found non-removable braces in her mutilated mouth that the schoolgirl wore to correct her bite. The news of the tragic death of the young cheerleader quickly spread through the small town and became the main topic of gossip the very next day. Within a matter of hours, every resident of Warwick learned about the terrible crime. The chilling news did not bypass Randy Wood, for whom that fateful day coincided with the annual football match, where he had been recognized as the king of the game for more than 1 season. Usually, after such competitions, loud celebrations were organized, but this time there was no time for fun. Stunned by the horrific discovery about the fate of his former friend, the young man went to the same bridge where Heather's mutilated body was found. Peering into the opaque river waters, Randy hid a terrible secret from everyone. After all, in reality, he knew much more than he had told the parents of the murdered girl. And soon the investigation led the police on the trail of the young football player and several of his comrades. This story resembled the script of a chilling Hollywood thriller. In the very heart of a small Oklahoma town, 3 teenagers turned an ordinary evening into a bloody massacre. One of them came from a wealthy family, the second was a star of school football and the team captain, and the third was a novice street hooligan. Starting the investigation, the detectives first talked to Heather's parents. By that time, Gail had already managed to calm many of her daughter's friends and acquaintances. Her suspicions fell on 2 young men: Heather's ex-boyfriend, 17-year-old Randy Wood, and her current boyfriend Josh Bagwell, who had just returned from a party and did not even bother to call. The woman was convinced that the young men were keeping something quiet. It seemed as if the high school students were retelling the same memorized story, sometimes even verbatim. However, they could not give a clear answer to additional questions, which looked extremely suspicious. Noticeably nervous, the teenagers were reluctant to make contact, unlike the rest of Heather's friends who actively joined the search for the missing girl. Gail intuitively felt that Randy and Josh were hiding much more than they said in their telephone assurances. Communicating with classmates and other friends of the deceased, investigators received several leads that indicated that Bagwell and Wood possessed information about the events of that fateful night when the schoolgirl ran away from home after an argument with her mother. It later emerged that Heather was indeed going to go to a party to meet her beloved Josh. Despite her parents' prohibition to stay out late, it did not stop the rebellious girl. After waiting for Gail and Dwayne to fall asleep, she jumped out the window around 11 o'clock at night. It was these 2 suspicious young men, well known and popular among local youth, who were supposed to wait for Heather that night. Josh was considered a rich descendant of wealthy parents. He always rode the most expensive cars and wore the most stylish clothes, willingly demonstrating his family's wealth. This young man was a typical representative of the golden youth, who was only interested in his own fame and money. In contrast to him, Randy Wood came from a simple family, but thanks to his talent and perseverance in sports, he gained no less popularity than his rich friend. His friends adored the handsome team captain for his virtuoso play on the field. Thanks to his achievements, he became the best football player not only in the school but also in the whole city, and even became famous among school teams at the state level. Randy and Josh were inseparable friends and usually spent their free time racing Josh's car on dirt roads. Of course, girls could often be found in their company. The young men regularly got drunk and sometimes smoked marijuana. Due to the lack of entertainment facilities for young people in the town, the teenagers simply had nothing to do, so they improvised as best they could. It is known that Heather Rich often spent her leisure time with this company. A friend said that Heather, along with them, tried grass and alcohol, and on the eve of her disappearance, she ran away to hang out with the popular guys. This news stunned the parents of the 16-year-old stray, a student who had embarked on such a dangerous path. Although the couple suspected their daughter's propensity for risky experiments, they did not even suspect that this was happening in the company of young men. It later became known that 5 days before the disappearance, on September 27, 1996, Heather herself and another cheerleader were caught in a corner of the stadium. Marijuana and smoking paraphernalia were found on them. The fact of alcohol consumption was also revealed. Because of this incident, the schoolgirls were suspended from classes for 3 days. The teachers informed Gail and Dwayne about everything, who did not hide their indignation, because they never expected that their 16-year-old daughter would get involved in such dangerous experiments. Heather admitted that she had tried the forbidden substances out of curiosity and promised to quit. However, the parents were more concerned about something else: why a diligent student and athlete had embarked on this wrong path at all. The young girl's fascination with drinking and drugs was frightening. Despite their daughter's assurances that she would get rid of bad habits, Gail and Dwayne were never able to convince themselves of her sincerity. Instead, these pernicious passions likely had a direct bearing on her death. The detectives decided to talk to Josh and Randy, with whom the murdered schoolgirl was last seen. They hoped to find out the details of the party that preceded Heather's disappearance. The football team captain admitted that he and his friend had spent the whole evening sitting in a trailer behind Bagwell's house, playing dominoes and drinking. However, both young men denied any contact with Heather that fateful evening. Interestingly, the police noticed the same details that had alarmed the mother of the deceased. Both young men retold exactly the same story, as if reading a memorized text, and spoke mechanically, like robots. Moreover, they showed almost no emotion, even though it was about the death of their mutual friend. Such behavior convinced law enforcement that the teenagers were lying. They suspected that the murder could have happened out of jealousy, when the young men could not share Heather between themselves. Of course, at that time, the investigators still lacked strong evidence that would directly link the high school students to the crime. However, the strange behavior of Randy and Josh reinforced the police's doubts about their possible involvement. Both found themselves in the role of the main suspects, so it was necessary to study their biographies, relationships with Heather, and the circumstances of the party that took place on the eve of her disappearance more carefully. The autopsy results provided new food for thought. First of all, attention was drawn to the number of shots, as many as 9. Even police shotguns usually hold 8 rounds in the magazine. Why would someone reload a weapon to fire an extra shot when the victim was obviously already dead? Another interesting detail is the type of ammunition used, the so-called double-aught buckshot. These powerful cartridges have excessive killing power for the execution of a 16-year-old girl. Fortunately, this specific choice of the criminal helped the investigation make its first serious breakthrough. These rare rounds were sold in only one store in the city. After checking the receipts, the police found out that shortly before the murder, they were purchased by only one person. The salesman recognized the same suspicious young man in the photo, high school student Josh Bagwell, who came to the store and bought a whole box, that is, 20 cartridges. According to the store employee, Josh was accompanied by another young man, but not his best friend Randy, but a certain Curtis Gamble, a guy well known to the local police. As it turned out, Curtis was the oldest among those involved in the case. He was already 19. Despite his young age, he had been arrested several times and spent most of his conscious life in juvenile correctional centers. This young man was completely inadequate and repeatedly came to the attention of law enforcement. He was detained for drunk driving, shooting animals, or even random passersby. Thus, the greatest suspicion fell on Curtis. Unlike the other two young men who, despite their strange behavior, had never had problems with the law before and were not considered aggressive or dangerous. On October 23rd, the police visited the home of the juvenile offender in a neighboring town where he lived. But even more important was the fact that just a few kilometers from his home was the same bridge under which fishermen stumbled upon Heather's mutilated body. Gamble himself was not found at home, but law enforcement officers talked to his grandmother. The elderly woman told about her grandson and, among other things, mentioned that he knew the area well and often visited the mentioned bridge. Curtis liked to fish there since childhood, and his grandmother had taken him with her more than once. So it turned out that the young man had a much closer connection with the crime scene than the police could have assumed before talking to his relative. The next day, the detectives were lucky enough to meet Curtis himself. The young man was detained and taken to the sheriff's office in Warwick. The interrogation lasted more than 8 hours, but the suspect essentially said almost nothing, although he agreed to take a polygraph test. However, even this did not become the main find of the investigators. Gamble's most valuable confession concerned his possession of a rather rare type of firearm, a Mossberg shotgun, the peculiarity of which is a magazine for 9 rounds. So, the detectives assumed that they had stumbled upon the owner of the probable murder weapon because Heather was shot from a shotgun of this type. When the weapon was seized and a ballistic examination was ordered, experts officially confirmed that the schoolgirl had been shot with Curtis's shotgun. After presenting evidence of his involvement in the murder of the young cheerleader, the guy gave up. He told the police that he had involved his 2 friends, Randy Wood and Josh Bagwell, in this crime, after which he wrote a detailed 2-page confession. 3 weeks after Rich's death, law enforcement finally had a suspect who admitted his guilt in the crime committed. Given the probable complicity of other young men, Wood and Bagwell were also arrested and taken to the station. The high school students were shown Gamble's testimony, where he claimed that he himself had initiated the massacre of Heather, but Randy had become the direct perpetrator. According to the confessor, he handed the shotgun to his friend and ordered him to shoot the innocent victim, while Josh was simply present. However, the police were skeptical about this testimony, since the football team captain did not fit the image of a typical criminal. In the past, the young man had never had problems with the law, was an exemplary student and a successful athlete, popular among his peers. No one ever spoke badly of him. Given the geography of the events, the party took place in southern Oklahoma, and the body was found in Texas. The guys were threatened with a trial in this particular state, where the death penalty is provided for murder. This became a key problem for the investigation, since according to local laws, the actual perpetrator could end up in the dock. Therefore, none of the suspects wanted to take the blame for the fatal shot. Only after persistent attempts by the police and a second meeting with investigators did Wood finally begin to testify. However, he categorically denied his direct participation in the murder, claiming that Gamble was the shooter and the initiator of the massacre of Heather, and Bagwell simply helped him. For his part, Josh refused to cooperate with law enforcement. So, in October 1996, detectives received 2 confessions that contradicted each other in many aspects. In the end, the investigators concluded that Randy's testimony seemed more truthful, and he also successfully passed a polygraph test. It became clear that it was unlikely that it would be possible to establish the exact sequence of events on the fateful evening of October 2nd with 100% accuracy, but it was decided to rely on the information provided by the football team captain. According to his confessions, on that day would plan to drink with his friends Gamble and Bagwell. When they gathered, it turned out that Heather Rich was supposed to join them. The girl knew Josh well and Randy himself, but had never met Curtis before, so she had no idea what a dangerous guy he was. When all four gathered and got thoroughly drunk, Heather, like the rest of the company, found herself on the verge of losing consciousness. It was at this moment that the drunk Gamble got the idea to take advantage of Heather's helpless state and mock her. He immediately proceeded to action. As Wood recounted, Rich woke up from the harassment and screamed, pushing the attacker away, and then fainted again. Despite the fact that she could barely move her tongue, Curtis got scared because even a half-drunk victim could remember everything when she sobered up. He knew very well that rapists are not met with friendliness in prison, and he did not want to end up behind bars because of this incident. Therefore, he suggested simply getting rid of Heather. The younger guys at first perceived these words as a bad joke, but Gamble was not joking. He really took a shotgun out of the trunk of his car and pointed it at the three teenagers. Wood and Bagwell realized that they were dealing with an extremely unpredictable guy, so they decided not to argue. They loaded the helpless schoolgirl into the trunk of Josh's car, and the whole company headed in the direction of Curtis's house. But a few kilometers from the destination, the older guy ordered them to turn towards the bridge, where the victim's body was later found. Gamble forced his friends to stop in the middle of the bridge, pull Heather out of the trunk, and put her by the railings. Fearing for their own lives, Randy and Josh obeyed. When the helpless Heather was pulled out of the car, she could not stand on her feet. The young men laid her on the ground and returned to the car, having no idea what would happen next. Curtis walked right up to the unconscious girl and started shooting. Randy saw with his own eyes how a huge hole was formed in the skull of his classmate. Unable to endure the eerie sight, he covered his face with his palms and was afraid to even look in that direction. The attacker emptied the entire magazine of the shotgun into the victim, after which he and Josh threw Heather's mutilated body off the bridge. Getting into the car, the guys fled the crime scene. They saw with their own eyes what Curtis had done to the young cheerleader, so fear for their own lives forced them to remain silent. In October 1996, the three young men were officially charged with the abduction and murder of 16-year-old Heather Rich. The investigators had the hardest time with Bagwell, who refused to testify and against whom there was essentially no direct evidence of involvement. The prosecution had to rely solely on the words of the other two defendants in the case, which contradicted each other. Due to the lack of physical evidence, the evidence base was not very reliable. To rectify this situation, the prosecutor offered Wood a plea deal. In exchange for testimony against Josh, the young man was promised life imprisonment with a right to parole after 30 years. Randy immediately agreed. The prosecutor's office also discussed with the parents of the deceased girl the possibility of a similar sentence for Gamble. In the opinion of the victim's family, the most important thing was to get the truth from him and not to send the juvenile organizer of the murder to the death penalty. The Rich family primarily wanted to know the truth. On October 15th, Curtis accepted the prosecution's offer and pleaded guilty in exchange for life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. At the same time, during the trial, he continued to behave defiantly and inadequately. While in custody awaiting trial, Gamble once attacked a guard, knocked him down, and began to strangle him. The enraged prisoner could only be restrained by the joint efforts of several police officers. In February 1998, almost a year and a half after the tragic death of Heather Rich, the trial of Josh Bagwell began. The case gained such publicity that there were an extraordinary number of people who wanted to attend the hearings. In the end, access to the courtroom was restricted, prohibiting both casual spectators and media representatives from being present. The defendants' lawyers resorted to various attempts to justify their clients. In fact, the attorneys tried to tarnish Heather's reputation, portraying her as an alcoholic and a promiscuous girl who allegedly had intimate relations with Curtis herself, and then began to threaten him with exposure, forcing the guy to resort to extreme measures. The parents had to defend the honor and dignity of their daughter. In reality, Heather was a diligent student, a talented athlete, and an extremely decent person who simply found herself in the wrong company and faced a real criminal. The floor was given to Gamble. To the surprise of those present, he suddenly returned to his initial version of events, claiming that Bagwell did not participate in the crime at all and was not even aware of the murder plans. Instead, according to Curtis, it was Wood who fired the fatal shot. This testimony deeply shocked Randy. Unexpectedly for everyone, the football team captain made a desperate move. He refused the plea deal. The young man did not want his confession to be regarded as dictated solely by the desire to save his own skin. Accusing his accomplices right in the courtroom, Wood stated that he primarily sought to achieve justice for the innocently murdered girl. This decision went against even the advice of the defendant's lawyer. Despite all the nobility of this act, Randy was consciously risking ending up in the death chamber. It was this selfless behavior of the young man that made an extraordinary impression on Heather's parents. The rich couple even personally met with Wood after the court session. Such a bold and principled step was of great importance for the family of the deceased. On February 10th, Randy appeared before the jury and told the whole truth about the horrific events of that fateful evening. His testimony left no doubt. The young man described in detail the full participation of Josh Bagwell and Curtis Gamble in the murder of Heather Rich, as well as Bagwell's role in concealing the traces of the crime. On February 14th, Curtis was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and the intentional commission of this especially grave crime. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with an additional term of 99 years. In May 1998, a meeting of Heather's parents with Randy Wood took place as part of a live talk show on television. Despite all the pain and grief of losing their daughter, the rich couple expressed sincere admiration for the honesty and deep remorse of this young man. On August 7, 1998, the trial of Wood ended. He was also found guilty of involvement in the murder. The young man was sentenced to life imprisonment with the right to parole after 40 years. This decision saddened many people, because Randy was the only one of the three defendants in the case who sincerely repented of what he had done and, risking his own life, decided to convey the truth to the jury. The prevailing opinion in society was that the guy did not deserve such a severe punishment. Josh Bagwell was also sentenced to life imprisonment without the right to parole. He was sent to serve his sentence in the same correctional institution as Gamble. In January 2002, both convicts made a daring escape attempt, taking advantage of the nighttime. They managed to hide in the state of Texas for 10 days. A nationwide manhunt was announced. Eventually, the fugitives were caught and returned behind bars to continue serving their life sentences. Adolescence is an extremely difficult and exciting period in the life of every person. It is quite likely that it is the behavior and decisions of parents at such moments that can determine what the future of their children will be. The tragic story of the death of young Heather Rich makes us think about how fragile human fate can be. The banal teenage desire to test one's limits, feel the adrenaline, and immerse oneself in the adult world turned into fatal consequences for Heather. This eerie story proves that the choice of friends, especially at such a vulnerable age, can radically affect all subsequent life. Of course, all responsibility cannot be shifted only to the parents. In adolescence, children often rebel and do not want to listen to the advice of their elders. However, It is during this period that it is very important to have wise mentors nearby who are able to direct in the right direction, warn against fatal mistakes, and support in difficult times. Unfortunately, in the case of Heather Rich, timely advice and help were not found. The horrific murder of the young cheerleader shook the small town of Warwick and became a tragic lesson for the entire society. This story reminds us how important it is to take care of each other, especially the least protected, our children. After all, sometimes even a single wrong company can lead to irreparable consequences. If you are interested in the details of this eerie crime, I invite you to subscribe to my Detective Brooks channel. There I regularly publish fascinating investigations of the most high-profile criminal cases that make even the most courageous shudder.